It is said that the American gun culture of today has developed out of the mystique of the gun. The romanticism of the Wild West's gunslingers, the expanding frontier, American individualism, the hunter, the legacy of the Second Amendment, gangs, the seduction of violent video games, armed mass killings, merciless terrorist attacks, and of course, Hollywood. But nothing could be further from the truth. The gun culture of modern America sprang up over 150 years ago from the unique wellspring of American ingenuity, entrepreneurship, inventiveness, savvy, and ruthless business practices. This is the real story of how America became armed. The story of America's first Silicon Valley, the Connecticut Valley of the mid-19th century. It is the story of the founding fathers of America's gun industry, Samuel Colt, Oliver Winchester, Eliphalet Remington, Horace Smith, and Daniel Wesson, as well as a cadre of lesser-known American gun innovators. It is the story of men who shaped America's military and industrial might.
All these guys together kind of formed a perfect storm of thought in the early 19th century. And they came up with the idea of making everything on the basis of interchangeability in parts. And this borscht that we're fed in school that Henry Ford invented the assembly line is just that. It's wrong. It's not correct. It's the gun industry in New England. It's the gun industry along the Connecticut River Valley, stretching from New Haven, where Winchester Arms exists, all the way up into Vermont at Robbins and Lawrence near Windsor, Vermont. All throughout that valley, you've got Winchester, Colt, Smith & Wesson, Allen. Everybody in the gun industry was along that river.
The arming of America started right from the beginning, when English colonists set their sights on America's eastern seaboard. First landing at Jamestown, Virginia, and then at Plymouth Colony near present-day Boston, Massachusetts. And they brought guns with them. For those early American colonists, a gun, a front-loading smoothbore musket or pistol, was an essential tool of survival, a tool that at first had to be imported from Europe. A tool that Americans would have to learn to make in order to ensure their independence. Every gun is essentially made up of three different parts. The barrel, essentially a long tube through which a projectile, a bullet, or shot travels. The stock, the part of the firearm that is designed to be held and handled by the shooter. Early on, the stock was often made from a single piece of wood. And finally, the lock, the part of the firearm that encompasses the ignition system, including some sort of trigger. It is with this final part of the gun that sometime in the early 1600s, the first great leap forward in firearms occurred with the invention of the flintlock mechanism. The flintlock solved a long-standing problem: firearm reliability. The flintlock ignition system reigned for 2 centuries with virtually no alteration. Early on, the question was, did Americans have the resources and skills to make such firearms? Of course they did.
Very early on, I think we see New England and the Mid-Atlantic states developing a tradition of craftsmanship in all kinds of things. But what I think is really interesting is even in the 17th century, we start to see along the Hudson River in upstate New York and along the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, we begin to see craftsmen tinkering with European designs already of firearms. And this is happening by 1660, 1670.
In the early days of American gunsmithing, individual craftsmen made individual components one at a time. One craftsman made the lock that would have been a flintlock, which besides the flint and steel was made largely from brass. The next craftsman made the gun barrel by heating a rolling iron. And the last craftsman, who was a woodworker, made the stock. At some point, a craftsman or a merchant started advertising lock, stock, and barrel, meaning that you could get your entire gun at one location and did not have to go from craftsman to get a finished firearm. This set in motion what would become the American gun industry. Dr. Pamela Hagg has written the definitive historical account of the rise of the American firearms industry. She argues firearms were viewed very differently in the early days of the colonies than today.
Today, particularly in the field of gun politics, when we're talking about the gun problem, there's an assumption that guns in America are rooted in a very exceptional history, and that is the history of the Second Amendment, which quite uniquely enshrines a right to bear arms. It is quite an exceptional aspect of our culture. But my argument in the Gunning of America is that part of the gun legacy and gun culture is actually grounded in unexceptionalism. When we look at guns as an industry and a business, the gun was pretty much treated just like any other commodity to be produced and sold. So it wasn't really considered exceptional by makers or buyers for much of its history. It was more like a plow or a shovel.
By the beginning of the 18th century, American gunsmiths were ready to make a revolutionary contribution to this early tool of necessity for survival. It's the story of not one single person, but a group of German-American immigrants. Built in 1719 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Martin Milan's gun shop is said to have produced the first Pennsylvania long rifle, which would eventually be called the Kentucky long rifle.
And then eventually, as the rifle moves from Pennsylvania into Kentucky and Tennessee, eventually a 4-foot and even, legendary 5-foot long models of these rifles. In short, they become known as the Pennsylvania long rifle, and these are flourishing in the 1750s, 1760s. One estimate shows that in that time period, probably in the neighborhood of 80% of the firearms that are being produced in Pennsylvania are in fact these rifles. And they're not staying in Pennsylvania. They're going to Virginia. They're being shipped up and down the coast.
The first indigenous American firearm, also a classic piece of folk art, the American long rifle, more commonly called the Kentucky rifle or the Pennsylvania rifle. Now, the differences between the Jaeger and the long rifle are well illustrated on this particular specimen. The long rifle, as the name suggests, has a very long barrel. It is full stocked. The wood stock extends from the butt of the rifle clear up to the muzzle of the rifle. The classic Kentuckys have a graceful droop to the stock like this one does, and this high degree of decoration, both using brass inlays, an ornate brass patch box, and carving of usually a beautiful tiger stripe wood stock. These are all features of the classic Kentucky rifle.
The Kentucky long rifle, the uniquely American gun, played a major role in helping the nation defeat the British and win the nation's independence. But the long rifle was initially made famous by the exploits of frontiersmen like Daniel Boone, the iconic figure in American history.
There was, some personality, some characters at the time that really rose up in society, people that were, heroes of the time. We have those heroes today. Back then, besides some politicians, there was woodsmen that rose to that level of esteem within the community, within the broader public, and Daniel Boone was certainly one of those. Davy Crockett was another. These guys were, at first, just very skilled hunters. They were the ones that, always got their game, were excellent shots, excellent woodsmen, excellent trackers, excellent navigators. And Daniel Boone in particular was what they classified as a long hunter.
He was a legend in his own lifetime, proclaimed as the typical all-American self-sufficient frontiersman. However, the frontier hero with his handcrafted, slow-firing, somewhat unreliable rifle was soon to come to an end.
Early on, guns were produced laboriously by hand by gunsmiths. There were never enough gunsmiths to repair the firearms that Americans had. It's hard to get a handle on how many guns colonial Americans actually had. Most of the estimates range from maybe as high as a third or a half in the north to maybe as high as 2/3 in the south. But in any case, a lot of these guns were in ill repair. Some of them didn't work, some of them were heirlooms. Gunsmiths worked mostly on repairing existing firearms, but the new country, for the most part, was not rich in gunsmiths. There were never enough gunsmiths. If every American had wanted a new gun or more guns, it would have been difficult to produce those guns, given labor and resources. So this is where we started, very dependent on guns from Europe.
This was unacceptable to the Founding Fathers, so with the war over, the new country had to decide what kind of government it wanted, but also, what was its economic vision for the future? Was it to be the Jeffersonian view of an agrarian society made up of independent farmers? Or Hamilton's view of a country based on trade and manufacturing? Ultimately, Hamilton's vision won out, and the new country moved into the 19th century with the promise of becoming an economic powerhouse. An economic powerhouse that needed a homegrown and stable means of weapons production. In order to do this, the nation had to industrialize.
The history of the gun industry is also the history of industry. It's where a lot of the innovation of industry first happened.
This happened when the United States government established armories in Springfield, Massachusetts and Harpers Ferry, Virginia, for the innovation and manufacture of firearms. With the newly minted Bill of Rights fully in place, President George Washington took stock of the nation's available armaments. Matters were in a deplorable condition. Arms had been taken home by discharged soldiers, and those put into storage had been allowed to deteriorate. With America potentially becoming drawn into the looming wars in Europe, something had to be done. So, in 1794, the United States Congress passed a bill calling for the erecting and repairing of arsenals and magazines.
The first one is established at a place called Harpers Ferry, then Virginia, today Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. But Harpers Ferry was picked for a couple reasons. One, perhaps most important, is the running water. If you've ever been to Harpers Ferry, it's at a confluence of sort of a creek and a river coming together. There's a lot of water flowing. So if you're going to have machinery, you want a water wheel to be able to turn, this is a good place to put it. And so the armory at Harpers Ferry is up and running by the early 1800s, and we start to see some interesting designs and interesting work being done at Harpers Ferry. It's a government endeavor, which is rather interesting, because up until this point, what we've seen in the 1700s, the earlier, the Pennsylvania gunsmiths, these are all private individuals. These are all private entrepreneurs. Now the state's getting involved. People like Jefferson are directing federal money to this armory to produce firearms. And it's shortly thereafter another armory is built up in Springfield in Massachusetts. And so that's sort of an interesting thing. Very early on in the American Republic, there is kind of a fusion of the state with this tradition, this homegrown tradition of craftsmanship kind of coming together.
It kind of works over the centuries literally as a seesaw back and forth as to whether it was private industry that developed the patterns and styles of the firearms that the armories would make, or whether it was stuff that was designed actually at the armories themselves.
History now tells us that the placement of the Springfield, Massachusetts Armory in the heart of the Connecticut River Valley was critical to establishing the American system of manufacture and innovation.
The Connecticut Valley, including New Haven, which is not technically in the Connecticut Valley, but close to it, was the Silicon Valley of industry and the Industrial Revolution. This was where the innovation in industry first occurred. Skilled labor then got concentrated in the Connecticut Valley, so gun manufacturing became focused in that area. So there was an innovation of capital, of labor, of machinery that really made Connecticut Valley the gun breadbasket to the world.
The first official firearm manufactured there was the legendary Model 1795 Springfield Infantry Musket. With war on the horizon, Congress thought it advisable to give out private contracts for additional manufacture of the 1795 musket. This brought about the gun series known as the 1798 contracts. 27 different contractors, many with no previous experience in manufacturing arms, were contracted for nearly 40,000 muskets at a price of approximately $13.50 each. The contracts were for varying quantities of muskets, from 200 by Nathan and Henry Cobb of Norwich, Connecticut, to 10,000 by Eli Whitney of New Haven, Connecticut, the inventor of the cotton gin. Thus began a partnership between private industry and the American military.
So we have private industry supporting the United States military by taking contracts to manufacture, as well as we have the armory system itself manufacturing on its own to supplement the needs of both the federal government and the state and local militias as well.
Now, with its own system of gun manufacture, the nation was once again thrust into war with the British. And once again, the War of 1812 demonstrated that the fledgling nation was up to the task of defeating a superior, well-armed European power. Although the war was largely fought with smooth-bore flintlock muskets, it did demonstrate that the United States could win with its own manufactured firearms. Manufactured firearms that also demonstrated that the private sector and government could work together in the industrial production of those firearms. At the same time, the production was replacing the old flintlock firing mechanism. This was just the beginning. American militias, armies, and frontiersmen fighting the Indians on the Great Plains were frustrated with the slow-loading flintlock weapons of the time. At the same time, American industrialization was on the rise, and many gun designers began to seek alternatives to muzzle-loading firearms. Enter John Hancock Hall. John Hall was born in 1781 in Portland, Maine. Working in his father's tannery as a young man, he eventually served in the Army. Around the age of 30, he began to experiment with firearms. Like many American gun innovators that were to follow, Hall began to conjure up ways to both simplify and increase the speed of loading weapons.
They thought a way of speeding up the ability to reload, get more lead down field faster, is to come up with a breech loading gun. And John Hall in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, developed a breech loading gun where you didn't have to ram it from the muzzle all the way down to the breech. You just popped the breech open and rammed it just that far, just far enough to seat it on the powder charge. Why go through all the process of getting it to push it down from here to the breech when you just had the breech pop open?
One of the more remarkable designs coming out of early Harper's Ferry is the Hall rifle, created by John Hall. He's given a contract to produce a revolutionary type of rifle as the War of 1812 is wrapping up in 1815. John Hall was such a stickler for precision parts, for getting things exactly right, even if that meant that lathe machine we're using isn't efficient enough. John Hall would design an entirely new machine. So he didn't just design the firearms, he designed all the cutting and stamping and drilling equipment that produced the firearms. And his standards were so precise, so exact, that you could take apart one Hall rifle and you could reassemble it using bits and pieces from another Hall rifle.
When he had that breech loading design, and it was okay, it wasn't a very practical example of a breech loading system because it didn't seal the breech. You still had gas escaping at the top and the bottom along the sides of the gun because there wasn't a perfect meet between the breech of the gun and the actual barrel to seal the escaping gas. But it was still faster than the average one.
Another important figure in the story of interchangeable gun parts for breech-loading rifles was Simeon North. Simeon North was born into a wealthy Connecticut family and is credited with the invention of the milling machine. It was the first entirely new type of machine invented in America. The milling machine made the production of interchangeable parts practical. In 1828, North received a contract to produce 5,000 Hall rifles with parts interchangeable with those produced at Harper's Ferry, once again cementing the highly productive relationship between the U.S. military and private industry. The Model 1819 rifle would go on to see action in the 1832 Black Hawk War in Wisconsin and Illinois, where future American leaders such as Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, and Zachary Taylor undoubtedly got their first look at this truly American weapon. In 1833, Congress authorized the Army to raise a regiment of horse-mounted dragoons for service on the western frontier. They would need a rifle suited for a soldier on horseback. Simeon North gallantly undertook the task of developing a breech-loading carbine, a shortened rifle, based on Hall's design. The final result was the Hall North breech-loading percussion carbine, manufactured in several designs between 1834 and 1853. These rifles would see their final action on both sides of the Civil War. However, solving the problems of the Hall North design breech loaders would fall to another great American gun innovator, Christian Sharps. Born in 1810, young Sharps apprenticed to a gunsmith in his hometown of Washington, New Jersey. In the 1830s, he accepted an entry-level position at the Harper's Ferry Armory. While at Harper's Ferry, Sharps was introduced to the famous John Hall and his remarkable breech-loading rifle. Quickly, Sharps became well-versed in the manufacture of firearms with fully interchangeable parts. By 1848, he had an idea for a new breech-loading design.
What Sharps does is he creates this curious obturation ring that he mounts in the back of his rifle. The way his rifle works is there's a trigger guard that's pulled like a handle, and basically the back end of the rifle falls out. And inset in that back end is a ring. And the ring, it's a little bit hard to describe, but in effect, the ring's job is to seal that escaping gas. And he cuts the ring in such a way that part of the ring is designed to catch the gas. And the ring's designed to sort of go back and forth. And the part that catches the gas pushes the ring back to sort of block the rear opening. So what Sharps is worried about is that gas. If that gas escapes, the whole gun can blow apart. But this ring that he creates, its strength, its power comes from the escaping gas. This is brilliant. Sharps is using the same force that can make the gun explode to seal the gun. And that is the breakthrough. That's the technological breakthrough that people have been looking for. And in the late 1850s, Sharps begins producing a line of safe, reliable, dependable breech loaders.
During the Civil War, the federal government bought over 80,000 Sharps carbines and nearly 10,000 Sharps rifles. Sharps and his company continued manufacturing firearms until his death in 1874. Obviously, breech-loading rifles required a new kind of ammunition. No longer was a rifleman pushing powder and lead ball down the barrel of his rifle, which was then ignited by a separate firing mechanism. The gun industry was moving rapidly towards a totally self-contained cartridge.
There was an evolutionary process in developing the self-contained cartridge, going from a system that used a separate lead ball, powder, and primer to that whole package in one unit. For example, this is a linen cartridge that was used in Sharps rifles. Eventually, it was replaced by a rimfire system that had the primer built into the rim of the cartridge itself. And this is the little bitty feller that started it right here in terms of widely used and effective self-contained cartridges. This was a rimfire cartridge. Today it's the 22 short, but it was introduced by Daniel Wesson and Horace Smith in their Smith & Wesson Model 1, which was really the first widely, commercially successful cartridge revolver that was not a pinfire. It took a rimfire system.
These two American firearms innovators, Hall and Sharps, were totally unaware they were creating the conditions for the American system of manufacture. And they were certainly unaware at the same time they were laying the foundation for what would become the American gun culture in the 20th and 21st century. The other half of the story is that America in this period, particularly in New England, was primed for an industrial revolution. Beginning with the Jacksonian era, American industrialization was guided mainly by the principle of laissez-faire, a governmental hands-off attitude to modernization, banking, transportation, and economic growth. And of course, the right to own and possess guns. As a result of these principles, the Jacksonian era unleashed an entrepreneurial and innovative force never seen before on the planet. Robert Fulton's invention of the steamboat connected American waterways for the movement of goods and people. Canals connected interior lands to the populated cities of the East. The old Northwest Territory, lands east of the Appalachians, were settled and began to thrive. But it is in the original northern colonies that a new system of industrialization was emerging, based on invention and entrepreneurialism not found anywhere else in the world. In New England, the Industrial Revolution was firmly established, with an abundance of water-powered textile mills. And steam-powered locomotives were beginning to connect cities up and down the East Coast. However, it is with guns, one of the common everyday tools of the early American experience, that a new kind of industrialization emerged during the Jacksonian era. And a big part of that industrialization is the story of Samuel Colt, one of the founding fathers of the American system of manufacture. His remarkable contribution to the American firearms revolution began when Texas won its independence from Mexico. Indeed, Colt's contribution to firearms design would solve two problems: the need for rapid fire of a handheld weapon and the ability to manufacture these weapons quickly. But who was Samuel Colt? In the 1830s, America was not tied down by the antiquated technology of producing single-shot muzzle-loading pistols. The American gun industry could start from scratch, designing and manufacturing breech-loading repeating handguns. It fell to American inventor Samuel Colt to make that idea a reality. Samuel Colt was born in Hartford, Connecticut on July 19, 1814. It is said that while reading a compendium of knowledge, a scientific encyclopedia, young Sam learned about gunpowder and inventors, including Robert Fulton, and decided to become one himself.
Samuel Colt came into the gun business through strange pathways. He had been on a tour to demonstrate the effects of nitrous oxide, laughing gas, to his audiences. He was very much a showman and an entrepreneur. So it wasn't that he had a particular fascination with guns per se. He was ambitious and wanted to find something to make and something to do.
But it wasn't until he went to sea that Colt conceived of the revolver. Legend has it that while on board the ship, he became fascinated with the way the ship's wheel worked. From that idea, he carved a wooden pistol with a rotating cartridge cylinder that allowed for multiple shots without reloading. Upon returning from the sea in 1835, Colt, at the age of 22, applied for a patent for his innovative multi-shot revolver. A year later, he received his patent and founded the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company in Paterson, New Jersey. Almost immediately, the now independent Texans were faced with a more formidable enemy: the great warriors of the southern plains, the Comanche, a tribe described during their heyday as the greatest light cavalry on earth. Indeed, these incredible horsemen could loose a flock of arrows while hanging off the side of a galloping horse. Beginning in 1836, the Comanche waged a campaign of terror against white settlers streaming into the brand new Republic of Texas. It was a highly successful campaign until John Coffee Hayes joined the legendary Texas Rangers. Known for improving discipline and morale, he also armed his men with a new kind of pistol, the famous Paterson Colt 5-shot revolver. Then, for the first time, at the Battle of Walker Creek, the Comanche came up against the new Texas Rangers. Indian Wars historian Greg Micknow tells the story of the battle and the Colt Paterson revolver.
It was revolutionary. It was the first revolving pistol, and it allowed a lot more rapid fire. Colt sold a number of pistols to the Texas Navy, and they used those for a while. When the Texas Navy was disbanded, about 180 of these pistols were passed on down to the Texas Rangers, which is more or less a civilian organization in Texas of men who would get together every once in a while to fight the Comanches and Kiowas. There was a man there, one of the Ranger captains, who was John Coffee Hayes, and quite a famous man later. He decided that these pistols would be pretty good, might be a good idea. Now, he figured if he could get each of his Rangers to have a couple of pistols, and then take the cylinder and get some 3 or 4 extra cylinders and have all of them loaded up when they went into battle, instead of trying to load one of these each individually, they'd break it down, take the cylinder out, drop it in their pocket, put a new cylinder in, ready to go again. Theoretically, I guess every man with 2 pistols and several extra cylinders could have 30 or 40 shots ready to go without having to reload. But would it work? Well, in June of 1844, Hayes went out from San Antonio heading northwest into the hill country, a little place that later became known as Walker Creek. They met up with about 70 Comanches. The Comanches tried to draw them out, make them chase them, lure them into the bushes. Well, Hayes was too smart for that. He wasn't going to bite on that, so he pulled back. The Comanches attacked, and the first thing the Rangers did, they also had rifles. They took the rifles, shot that, threw the rifle down. The Comanches figured, we got them now, they're out of bullets. They kept coming. Of course, then out come the Patterson Colts. Several shots like that, Comanches fall back again with a few casualties. They figure they're done. They come on again. Hayes is still ready. Actually, he put his men, he'd had about, like I said, 14 guys in him. They put him into a little like pinwheel almost. The horses rump to rump, so they had a 360-degree coverage. The Comanches would come on all angles. The men kept shooting. Out, take a cylinder, pop a new one in. They kept going. It decimated the Comanches. They were completely unexpected. And they left a great number of dead and wounded on the battlefield. And Hayes had proved a point right there. So right from that time, that was the start of a legend almost. A small number of Texas Rangers with their horse being brave and having a revolving pistol that could shoot multiple times.
Thanks to Captain John Coffee Hayes, the Battle of Walker Creek signaled a turning point in Indian warfare on the American plains. A turning point because it marked the first time that repeating firearms were effective in close combat with the Comanche. Among the wounded was Samuel Walker. He would eventually collaborate with Samuel Colt to create the Colt Walker Revolver, a gun that revolutionized warfare and played a crucial role in the history of the West. Gun manufacturing in America was a difficult business in the 1840s, and soon after the sale of the Patterson revolver to the Texas Republic, Colt was in financial trouble.
Sam Colt is best known for the Patterson revolver and inventing the practical revolving handgun. The revolver, the Colt, pistol. But by 1842, 1843, Colt was done. Stick a fork in him, he's out the door. You wouldn't even know the name Samuel Colt if you had 1 out of 10 guesses today. If it wasn't for a Texas Ranger named Sam Walker that just blindly wrote a letter to Colt in 1847 saying, we met in Florida back in the Seminole War, and you demonstrated your revolving rifles and pistols, and I would like to order 1,000 of them for the Army. And this was something Colt had dreamt of. That never happened for him. The Texas Republic did. But the U.S. government, whose purchase power is almighty even to this day, but even was back then, people thought, well, if the U.S. government thought enough of it, then certainly it's got to be good enough for us too. To the Navy was what his main pursuit was at the time. So sure, Colt being the showman that he was, he said, sure. He lied through his teeth. I'll make you 6. In 6 months, I'll make you 1,000 guns, no problem. And he said, send me some earnest money and we'll get started. So what Walker does is he describes to Colt a gun that's considerably larger and heavier than the Patterson revolver that he had used in Florida. He describes how he wants a trigger guard on the Walker, which the Patterson Colt didn't have. He wanted it to be substantially heavier. It could be used as a club if need be, which the Patterson was too small for. He wanted the loading lever on the gun itself so that if he needed to load the gun, he didn't have to go into a special kit or case to do so. And he even hand drew the blade front sight, where the Patterson had a little bead dot. he had a blade front sight to the Walker.
With the help of Eli Whitney Jr., Colt miraculously fulfilled the 1,000 gun order in less than 6 months.
And we have a product mass-produced, 1,100 actually, 1,000 for the Army, under one roof, completely in-house. And if a part broke in the field, which unfortunately in the case of the Walker was quite often, you just could swap parts with another gun. And that had never happened before. And Colt had a contract with the federal government for the first time, and he still has one to this day because of that. And he establishes his own factory to manufacture those guns, and still in Hartford, Connecticut today. And thus begins the Industrial Revolution, begins it with firearms.
By 1847, the Colt Walker was the largest and most powerful black powder repeating revolver ever made. Reaching the rank of captain and carrying 2 of his namesake pistols, Walker led a company of Texas Rangers into battle in the Mexican-American War. As for Samuel Colt himself, he wanted the world to know what he had accomplished. The year was 1851. The place was London, England.
In 1851, the Crystal Palace exhibition in London. It's the biggest thing to hit planet Earth as far as the show is concerned. This is entertainment, this is infotainment, 19th century style. And it's the first time the planet's ever been really exposed to something like that. There have been exhibitions and art shows and stuff like that, but this was a World's Fair. And it was bringing all of science and art together under one roof, and in this case, the Crystal Palace in London. 1851, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, speaking with thick, heavy Hanoverian accent, he goes through the halls there, and the press of the day is following him around, making notes of every little thing he shows an interest in. And of course, he shows a great deal of interest in the most modern firearms. So here basically a huckster from the States, you know, is there to show off his guns. He's Samuel Colt. He's got the 1851 .36 caliber Navy revolver. And so with the prince and all of his entourage and attendants with him, he sits down, and Colt takes 9 revolvers and lays them out on the table. Shows everybody that they work. Then he has his assistants come and field strip all the guns down to springs and pins. And then they mix it all up on the table, scoop it into a gunny sack at the end of the table, shake it up, redistribute the parts all over the table again, and the assistants grab a barrel, grab a cylinder, grab a grip strap frame, not paying any attention to whether there's matching numbers on these things. Any screw will fit the back strap. Any screw will fit the fore-end strap. And they grab those and they put the guns together, and within minutes they have 9 working guns. Now to you and me, that doesn't, I mean, we're used to going to the Ace Hardware or the AutoZone and saying we want a spark plug for a 53 Mazda or whatever you got, they hand it to you, it goes right in, right? That didn't happen back then. Anytime you put a screw into something, you had to, whether the pitch of the threads was the same as what you were using, which is what this had never happened before. Their Royal Highness's collective jaws dropped. And it made the front page of Frank Leslie's Illustrated London News all over the world. This had been demonstrated to the world that mass production, industrial machines could make things out of interchangeable parts, and it electrifies everybody.
The Crystal Palace was the London Exhibition of Industry in 1851, and for many of the American gun manufacturers, this was a kind of portal into the business in Europe. It was an introduction of what was then called the American system of manufacturing into Europe and to the European public. And observers rightly understood that this was going to transform manufacturing and industry, and that they were now lagging behind in gun production, even though Britain and Belgium had been at the forefront in the age of the gunsmiths.
The Colt Walker was just the first of many brilliant pistol designs made by Samuel Colt leading up to the Civil War. For NRA Museum curator Philip Schreier, the 1860 Colt Army embodies the brilliance and aesthetics that Samuel Colt poured into his firearms.
Enjoy your visit to the museum, and thank you. Here's the Colt 1860 Army. It's a 44 caliber. But look at these, the lines on this gun, how it flows. It literally, this steel cascades down around the loading lever. This is the loading lever, and it has a rack and pinion lever to it. It's not just a screw. I mean, some real thought and time was put into this and the design. And it wasn't just considered, oh, well, that's practical, let's run with it. Look how you have a rebated cylinder. The strong part where the main charge is going off is thicker up here, while this part is stepped back a little. The gun is blued and then case color hardened. They didn't have to go through that, but they did to make it a beautiful gun. The same with the trigger, the brass backstrap. Most of these were sterling silver plated over the brass, and it's just a wonderful gun that fits easily into your hand, points real well, and at 44 caliber is a very effective sidearm for defense.
Remarkably, by 1855, Colt had the largest private arms manufacturing facility in the world. His Blue Onion Dome Armory on the banks of the Connecticut River. Sadly, this American innovator, industrialist, and founding father of the American system of manufacture passed away on January 10, 1862, at the age of 47. It is estimated that in its first 25 years of manufacturing, Colt's company produced over 400,000 revolvers. After he died, his manufacturing plant on the banks of the Connecticut River and his company passed on to his wife and family. The company continued to design and manufacture ever more successful handguns, including the famous Colt Peacemaker. However, Colt's company is not the only American firearms giant that got its start pre-Civil War. The next story of America's firearms founding fathers begins with a dramatic improvement in firearms accuracy and deadliness. The transformation started with the Model 1855 Springfield rifled musket. It was produced by the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and at the Harpers Ferry Armory in Virginia. Earlier muskets had mostly been smooth-bore flintlocks. In the 1840s, the unreliable flintlocks had been replaced by more reliable and weather-resistant percussion cap systems. The smooth barrel and inaccurate round ball were also being replaced by rifled barrels and the newly invented Minié ball.
By the time of the American Civil War, there have been some important changes in firearm technology, and the biggest one involves the projectile, the thing that comes out of the barrel. And this begins with a Captain John Norton of the British Army. He's the first one to begin tinkering with this, but the most famous is a Frenchman by the name of Minié.
Now, as you can see, it's a conical bullet, which is more ballistically efficient than a round ball, and they discovered that some time back, that a conical bullet could be more effective. But what Minié did was he put a hollow base on the bullet. Now, when this bullet is fired, in a rifle, the gas will engage that hollowed out base, expand that lead skirt to engage the rifling, so the mini ball can actually be slightly smaller than the bore diameter of the rifle that it's loaded into, which makes it as easy to load as the round lead ball, but with the advantage that the skirt will expand and engage the rifling and give it the spin coming out of the barrel and the additional range and accuracy of a rifled projectile.
In order to get around Samuel Colt's patents, in 1848, another American firearms genius named Walter Hunt came up with an improvement on the mini ball. He called it the rocket ball. His bullet had a deep hollow space in the base. This hollow space served the same purpose as the mini ball, to expand the base of the bullet when it leaves the barrel of the rifle. However, the hollow space design also had a second use. Walter Hunt filled it with gunpowder and sealed the base with a cap that had a small round hole for ignition. Creator of the safety pin and many other inventions, Walter Hunt was born in 1796 in upstate New York. Though barely known to history, Hunt, a prolific Yankee mechanical genius, played a critical role in the rise of the American firearms industry. His 1849 design for a volitional repeater rifle made clever use of several other recent discoveries in repeating mechanisms, breech-loading rifles, and bullet design. Hunt sold his design to entrepreneur George Arrowsmith. Soon after, the design went into production by the Robbins and Lawrence Arms Company.
This was one of the first successful efforts to put together a repeating firearm. The key to this was the ammunition, and the ammunition was a conical ball on it that had a hollow base on it with powder in the base and a fulminate type of primer that was on the back of the powder. So when this gun fired, there was no casing. Everything went out the end of the barrel. The gun worked. The ammunition was kind of delicate though, and it wasn't very powerful. So the first efforts here, you had a repeating gun that actually functioned and actually worked. And about the time of the Civil War, these guns were available at that time, but for rugged purposes such as war and all that, they were underpowered and a little bit delicate for that type of use.
Working at the Robbins and Lawrence Arms Company were three men trying to improve the faulty firing mechanism: Benjamin Tyler Henry, Horace Smith, and Daniel B. Wesson. And thanks to Hunt's design deficiency, the partnership of Smith and Wesson was born. In 1855, an arms conglomerate directed by Oliver F. Winchester bought out Smith & Wesson's company, among other purchases, eventually forming the New Haven Arms Company, which produced one of the most fearsome weapons of the Civil War, the Henry repeating rifle. However, like good entrepreneurs, Smith & Wesson would go on to start another company that would become one of the greatest manufacturers in American history. None of it would have happened without Walter Hunt's volitional repeater. The repeating rifles and handguns designed and manufactured by the North were instrumental in the Union's final triumph over the South. Best known of the breech-loading lever-action repeating rifle that found its way onto Civil War battlefields was in fact the 1860 Henry rifle, predecessor to the now famous line of Winchester rifles.
Well, this Henry rifle was an absolutely revolutionary design at the time, but today gun experts consider it probably the most revolutionary design of the 1860s. The major advance, of course, is that this was a repeater semi-automatic, a kind of semi-automatic rifle, so working the trigger performed multiple functions, which was something quite new. So instead of being able to get off 2 shots in a minute with a muzzle loader, if you were lucky, You could shoot as fast as you could work the trigger, so maybe 16, perhaps 30 shots a minute.
Benjamin Tyler Henry was born in Claremont, New Hampshire in 1821. He apprenticed to a gunsmith as a young man and worked his way up to shop foreman at the Robbins and Lawrence Arms Company in Windsor, Vermont. On October 16, 1860, Henry received a patent for the groundbreaking Henry .44 caliber repeating rifle, a rifle which soon proved the worth of the lever-action design on the battlefields of the American Civil War.
The New Haven Henry rifle. Now this gun shot a rimfire .44 caliber cartridge that once again the cartridge exited the barrel and the action worked and it threw the case out up here. And this is one of the first examples of an actual lever action rifle.
Much faster still is if you work a lever, fire a shot, work a lever, fire a shot, work a lever, fire a shot. Probably one of the oldest sayings in guns is that the Confederates called the Henry rifle that damn Yankee rifle that you load on Sunday and shoot all week. And it was a 16 shooter. It takes a lot of effort to fire 16 shots from a muzzle loader in the heat of combat.
While there were few gun innovations that occurred during the Civil War, one proved to be immensely important: the Gatling gun. Richard Gatling was born in Hertford County, North Carolina in 1818. He was another of a long line of American entrepreneurial and inventor geniuses that turned their attention to the gun industry. After many successful inventions, Gatling invented what became known as the Gatling gun after he noticed that a majority of the soldiers fighting in the Civil War were lost to disease rather than gunshots. In 1877, he wrote, "It occurred to me that if I can invent a machine, a gun, that could by its rapidity of fire enable one man to do as much battle duty as 100, that it would, to a large extent, supersede the necessity of large armies, and consequently, exposure to battle and disease would be greatly diminished."
The Gatling gun comes in many, many different versions. You'll see some that are all brass and much shorter and lighter than this. But when people think of the Gatling gun, they think of this Gatling design. To operate the gun, first you loaded the ammunition this is a stick magazine. They also had different magazines. But you loaded the magazine in here, you grabbed this handle right here and you just started cranking. And once the first round hit the firing position, which was this position right here, it would fire, and then it would fire every time a barrel came around. A lot of people think that every barrel fired every time, but the only position that fired was this position right here. So when this barrel came down to this position, it would fire. And that barrel turned as you turn this crank, okay? And the ammunition, it was an ingenious method, was gravity fed. Just the weight of the bullets would drop the ammunition into the chambers. Okay, so it was very simple, very effective, and very reliable.
With the Civil War over, America was about to enter the golden age of gun innovation. Because of the Civil War effort, the United States was fundamentally changed. It was transformed from an agricultural to an industrial country. Factors contributing to this remarkable economic revolution included the massive availability of raw materials, timber, iron ore, oil, and gold. A large labor force constantly replenished by immigration, and a transcontinental railway system unifying the nation. All of these factors greatly benefited the gun industry.
The industry set up a distribution network using rail. So typically, Winchester, the repeating arms company, would sell to jobbers who would then distribute. So some of the major points for gun purchase would be St. Louis, New Orleans. The largest gun merchant was actually in Lower Manhattan.
And most importantly, this spectacular wave of new inventions and technologies was led by a cadre of highly talented but often ruthless business leaders. At the forefront of this great change was the American firearms industry.
The first generation gun industrialists were self-made. They were risk takers. They were extremely innovative, not only in how they thought about making things, but also in how they thought about waging corporate warfare, being aggressive, using laws to support their bottom line, using the idea of incorporation to advance the bottom line. For the most part, they were more in love with the means of making things and the particular thing that they made. So they were interested in methods, in machinery. They were empirical. They were very grounded in the material world of how to make things better, faster, more the same.
The winners among these early risk-taking industrial giants were the Smith & Wesson Company, Remington Arms Company, Winchester Repeating Arms Company, and the Colt Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company. Although Colt himself died before the Civil War, the company he founded, Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, continued to make some of the best firearms in the world right up to today. Many will argue that during the golden age of firearms, Colt's single-action Army revolver, also known as the single-action Army Peacemaker, or the gun that won the West, was not only adopted as the standard military service revolver from 1873 until 1892, but also was the chosen handgun of ranchers, lawmen, and outlaws.
This is a Colt 1873 single-action Army, often referred to as the Peacemaker. It was a real breakthrough in firearms as it was chambered in a very powerful cartridge, the .45 Colt. It was very easy and quick to reload. You just bring the hammer back to half cock, open the loading gate, put a round in, turn the cylinder, and keep doing that until you get 5 or 6 rounds in it. Close the gate, pull the hammer back to full cock, and it was ready to fire. To unload it, you just reverse procedure, open the loading gate, use the ejector to push the fired round or the fired brass out. You keep doing that until the gun is empty, then you just reload it and you're ready to go again. This particular Colt was sold to the Army in 1874.
This is a 4 3/4 inch Colt. Most of these guns were 7.5 inch and 5 inch guns until Bat Masterson, actually, he ordered a gun from here in Dodge City. He wanted it cut down just a little bit longer than the ejector rod, and he wanted it easy on the trigger. This is known as the Bat Masterson gun. He needed a short gun that was easy to get out of a holster. And of course, his most preferred method of dispensing justice was to get up in that man's face and draw that 6-shooter out and knock him upside the head with it.
Colt's primary competition in American handguns was a company founded by Horace Smith and Daniel B. Wesson. Horace Smith was born in Cheshire, Massachusetts in 1808. Always the inventor and gunsmith, he was employed by the U.S. Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts from 1824 to 1842. 17 years younger than Smith, Daniel Baird Wesson was born into a working-class family in Worcester, Massachusetts. Apprenticed early on to a gunsmith, he became a brilliant firearms designer. The two met in Norwich, Connecticut, and founded the Smith & Wesson Company in 1852 to develop the first repeating rifle, the volcanic rifle. In addition, Smith developed a new volcanic cartridge, which he patented in the mid-1850s. The Smith & Wesson Company was renamed Volcanic Repeating Arms in 1855 and eventually was purchased by a dress shirt manufacturer by the name of Oliver Winchester. Smith & Wesson went their separate ways, but would reunite in 1856 to develop a small rim-fired pistol, the Smith & Wesson Model 1. This revolver was the first successful, fully self-contained cartridge revolver available in the world. Smith & Wesson secured patents for the revolver, giving the young company a lucrative future.
The real important thing about the Smith & Wesson design was they experimented with a hinge action revolver. And they used percussion, just like Colt did, but Colt's reloading system was a bit cumbersome. It was a bit slow. You had to sort of load each chamber, and he had a special ramrod device attached to his pistol. Smith & Wesson calculated, hey, why not just have a special lever that you flip and the front end of the gun opens up and you can just load the cartridges from behind. And that spooked some people. They thought, wow, that seems a little fragile. That gun might explode in my hand. But Smith & Wesson made it very, very reliable.
The partners realized that when their original patents expired, they would need a new design to maintain their market superiority. This new design was completed in 1869. The Model 3 was the first large-caliber cartridge revolver and established Smith & Wesson as a world leader in handgun manufacturing.
The gun that was produced in the greatest number between the 1870 to 1900 era was the Smith & Wesson Model 3. Now this was introduced in 1870, 3 years before the Colt Single Action Army. The Model 3 in general, there are a number of different variations of it. It's a very different system of loading and unloading. To load it, a latch is opened, the barrel is tilted down, empties are automatically ejected out the rear of the cylinder, leaving the rear of the cylinder open to load easily. Your 6 rounds close and you're ready to go again, 6 shots. A much quicker reload than on the Single Action Army pattern, but the gun is a little more delicate. Not really delicate, but not quite as sturdy as the Colt Single Action Army. Major types of Model 3s were made by Smith & Wesson. First the American model, the Russian model, the Schofield model beginning in 1875, such as this one, and in 1878, all 3 of those were discontinued, and the new model number 3 replaced them in the Smith & Wesson single action line. Again, the same system, top brake opens, ejects the empties, reload, and close. A very accurate gun used to win many of the target competitions of the time.
The 2 most important customers for the new revolver were the United States Cavalry, which purchased 1,000 units for use on the western frontier, and the Russian Imperial government. But Colt and Smith & Wesson had competition in the 6-shooter market, the Remington Arms Company.
America's oldest gun maker, Remington, was also a significant player in the 6-gun market for the Old West. Now this design, the Remington single action design, again is a big 6-shot 44 caliber revolver. Folks said, hey, that looks a lot like the Single Action Army. Well, Remington took exception to that because the Remington that we used in the Civil War, the percussion Remington, had this basic design of the enclosed top strap, whereas the Colts of the Civil War era, like the 1860 Army, had an open top. Remington contended that the Colt was a copy of the Remington design rather than vice versa. But again, a very popular Old West 6-gun.
Eliphalet Remington II was born in 1793 in the town of Suffield, Connecticut. Legend has it that young Remington believed he could build a better gun than he could buy at the time, and set out in 1816 to craft such a gun on his father's forge. He succeeded, and his flintlock was such a success at a local shooting match that he was soon in the gun business.
Remington took advantage of the Erie Canal. Remington might have just been any other small firearm maker, but Ilion, New York is on the Mohawk River. The Mohawk River winds up connecting to Lake Ontario by means, and Lake Erie, by means of the Erie Canal. And the fact that he happened to be sitting on that key waterfront meant that his guns could just, they had the gateway to the West right there. They could just travel up the river, out into the frontier. And I think that was a big part of Remington's success. He made great firearms, and to this day, Remington makes outstanding firearms. But having that canal there, that was lucky for him.
Eliphalet Remington had 3 sons, Philo Remington, Eliphalet Remington III, and Samuel Remington, all of whom followed their father into the family business. A business they took over when their father died in 1861, a year before Samuel Colt passed away, turning his business over to his family. The first big success of the Remington sons was the state-of-the-art Remington rolling block rifle, a breech-loading rifle produced from the mid-1860s into the early 20th century. Its prototypes are now on display at the NRA National Sporting Arms Museum in Springfield, Missouri.
Well, these are some of the prototypes of the guns that were used in the early West, like this Remington split breech was a predecessor of the Remington rolling block, and this here is the prototype of that design. Then this next one down here is the actual split breech carbine that came out, and then the eventual rolling block that became one of the guns that was famous in the development of the Old West.
The action of the rolling block rifle was extremely strong and could easily withstand the increased pressure of the newly invented smokeless powder coming into use by the late 1880s. Along with the Sharps rifle, the Remington rolling block was one of 2 rifles used by the buffalo hunters on the Great Plains. Remington also designed and produced a popular Derringer pistol. The Remington 2-shot Derringer was manufactured and sold for almost 70 years, from 1866 to 1935.
This is a little Remington 2-shot Derringer. Again, it was pretty prevalent in the Old West. They were a little 2-shot. They usually used rimfire ammunition, and to load it, you just tip the barrels up, put 2 rounds in it, close it, lock it, cock the hammer, and you're ready to shoot. Very popular with gamblers. If you think concealed carry is something new and innovative in today's world, this gun could go anywhere, all right? And you would know that the person had it. So folks that wear suits, gamblers, ladies of the evening, a lot of them carried these little Derringers for protection. Very handy. Again, not a long-range gun. They weren't designed to be long-range. But they did work. At the distances they were used at, they were potent, because a very short distance gun, accuracy was not an issue with these guns. They weren't meant to be accurate, because they were kind of what I call a belly gun. You know, if you got into a disagreement with somebody, you put one of these in his belly and pull the trigger. And that was usually the end of the fight.
For all of these early and successful gun manufacturers, their hallmark was their ability to mass-produce high-quality firearms. Firearms that jump-started the American Industrial Revolution. And they did it by becoming global economic powerhouses.
It's really important to note that for all of these first gun industrialists, they were seeking military contracts abroad. So every single one of them sold profligately abroad in the 1850s and 1860s, and pretty much stayed in business in the years before and after the Civil War, seeking out that kind of business, and that was particularly true of Remington. So I would say that all of the big 4 sought out actively the military contracts, if not in the US, then elsewhere.
However, when it came to long guns, no one would exploit the global firearms market better than Oliver Winchester with his repeating rifles. Called America's greatest gun capitalist, Oliver Winchester didn't invent the guns that bore his name, nor the machines that made the guns, but he did develop their markets in the US and abroad. Prior to the Civil War, the United States gun industry had created the American model of manufacture. Now, the gun industry was going to show the country how to market all of its products. Oliver Winchester fully understood the unique relationship between America and its guns when he celebrated the anniversary of the nation's Declaration of Independence from British rule by introducing his Model 1876 big game hunting rifle at the Philadelphia Centennial. Teddy Roosevelt, the shootingest president, said of his gun, "The Winchester 1876 is by all odds the best weapon I ever had, and now I use it almost exclusively."
During the time period of the 19th century, many of the rifles went the same direction as the handguns did. They went from the muzzle-loading rifles to the breech-loading rifles, and during that same shift, started using metallic cartridge ammunition as opposed to loose black powder and ball. The history of the American firearms industry tends to be a small number of successes built on a large number of failures. There were many, many companies that were manufacturing guns at one time or another in the United States, mostly in the states of Massachusetts and Connecticut. The companies that did come up through that period would tend to either be bought up, bought out, or sued to death by some of the larger companies like Winchester, Colt, Smith & Wesson, Marlin, and other companies. The companies that we see today as being the successful companies that are from the 19th century, they tend to be the ones who had the most money and corporate sense to be able to continue on into the 20th century.
Firearms historians argue that the most colorful and successful of these firearms companies was, and still is, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Its founder, Oliver Winchester's lever action, did for rifles what Samuel Colt's revolving cylinders did for handguns. It dramatically increased the rapidity of firepower for a rifleman. Lever-action rifles are still part of shooting competitions at the NRA Whittington Center in Raton, New Mexico. Its executive director, Wayne Armacost, describes the lever-action rifle.
High capacity, very easy to operate, simply a lever that got brought down, which brought a cartridge forward. As it was brought back up, that cartridge was then put into the tube, and it was a rapid fire, so as fast as you could pull the trigger and manipulate the lever, the firearm would shoot.
Born in Boston in 1810, Oliver Winchester's early life is a bit of a mystery. His initial foray into business was as a maker of men's dress shirts in New Haven, Connecticut. Seeing the economic potential of the fast-growing firearms industry, Winchester began to assemble investors and secure venture capital. And in 1857, bought a controlling interest in the financially troubled Volcanic Repeating Arms Company from Horace Smith and Daniel B. Wesson.
Oliver Winchester was not particularly interested in guns so far as we know. Apparently he didn't display them in his house, he might not have even owned one or ever shot one. And it is somewhat of a mystery why he did have such an obsessive faith in the repeater rifle. He was wealthy in 1855, he wanted something else to invest in, and he had encountered Benjamin Tyler Henry's work on Artisan Street near his factory, and he was intrigued. One of the big lures for a self-made man and manufacturer to get into the gun business was that theoretically you could get contracts for military use, and that would absorb a lot of the volume that you could produce. So initially, Winchester's idea was that this repeater rifle would be a weapon for war.
Fortunately for Winchester, he inherited the brilliant and pivotal firearms engineer Benjamin Tyler Henry, the inventor of the first reliable lever-action rifle.
One of his key designers is a guy named Henry, and the rifle is named after this designer, but in fact Winchester's the one to ultimately have the patent and own it.
Initially, the Henry was not a great financial success, largely because the United States military during the Civil War thought it was too expensive.
Fortunately for the South, unfortunately for the North didn't get their hands on a heck of a lot of them. It was very, very expensive. It was about $50 a rifle, and in those days that was considered, a lot of money. So you did not have huge federal units equipped with the Henry rifles, but a handful of them did. A handful of them got a hold of them. Sometimes soldiers would save their money and purchase a Henry. Under 2,000 served in the war. The few times they go into battle, though, they absolutely amazed the Confederates.
However, in 1866, Benjamin Henry and Winchester had a falling out, and Winchester cleverly reorganized New Haven Arms into a new company, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, on July 1, 1866. Winchester immediately hired brilliant firearms designers and had the Henry rifle completely modified and improved to become the first rifle that bore his name, the Winchester Model 1866. It fired the same .44 caliber rimfire cartridges as the Henry, but had an improved magazine and, for the first time, a wooden forearm. The 1866 Winchester shared a unique double firing pin which struck the head of the rimfire cartridges in two places when the weapon was fired, increasing the chances that the fulminate in the hollow rim would ignite the 28 or so grains of black powder inside the case.
This is a Winchester Model 1866. This is a follow-on to the famous Henry from the Civil War. The Henry rifle was really the first true lever-action repeating rifle that was developed. There was two big drawbacks to the Henry rifle. First and foremost, it did not have a forestock on it, and under rapid fire, it was hard to hang on to because the barrel would get really hot. And the other was the way that the Henry loaded, which you basically had to twist the front part of the barrel and drop the ammunition down into the magazine tube. The big advancement with the 1866 was what they called, back in those days, the King's patent, which we know today as the loading gate. And you actually all you had to do to load this was, you just push the bullets into here into the magazine, and it was very, very rapid to reload, and being a true lever action, it was very quick to fire. The only drawback to the 66 was it used the same rimfire .44 caliber ammunition that the Henry did, and it was a metallic self-contained cartridge, but it was rather anemic. It didn't have a whole lot of firepower to it. And what this led to, that the 66 led to, was the 1873 Winchester that used a more powerful centerfire cartridge.
The classic gun cited as the gun that won the West is usually either the Colt single-action Army or, probably more frequently, the Winchester lever-action rifle, specifically the Model 1873. And certainly it was very popular. It was a lever-action repeater. It was the successor to the Henry rifle that had been introduced during the Civil War, and then a brass frame Winchester, the Model 1866. 1873 kind of brought the entire package together. It got away from the brass frame, went to the steel frame, and was a very effective lever-action rifle.
A popular quote about the Winchester 73 proclaims, "Be not afraid of any man, no matter what his size. When danger threatens, call on me, and I will equalize." Its sole purpose would have been for killing people. It was famous outlaw Billy the Kid's weapon of choice.
He had the look, he had a Winchester. He preferred his Winchester to a pistol. And when he met the governor of New Mexico on a dark, cold night, he came in the door with his Winchester in his right hand and a pistol in his left. Now, authors since then have tried to reverse that because they think, no, wait a minute, didn't he want his pistol in his right hand? He wanted his Winchester. And he was quoted as saying, I can lick half this crowd with my trusty Winchester.
Ned Christie was a famous Cherokee tribal council member and gunsmith in Oklahoma Territory. When he was accused of murdering a deputy, hanging Judge Isaac Parker issued a warrant for Christie's arrest and sent a posse from Fort Smith, Arkansas to capture Christie. In the battle that followed, Christie was shot dead. This grisly and historic photograph illustrates the state of firearms in the Old West. Here is the posse with Christie's dead body on a board, holding his 1873 Winchester rifle. With the exception of one man, the posse members are all armed with 73 and 1886 Winchesters, and two men are also packing 1873 Colt Peacemakers. The seated man in the foreground at left holds a single-shot military 1873 Springfield trap-door rifle. In the Wild West, outlaws, lawmen, and Indians essentially used whatever weapons they could get their hands on. However, the future of the American gun industry was not in the Wild West, but elsewhere. Oliver Winchester led the way for American firearms manufacturers in realizing that the big market for their guns was, initially, in military purchases around the world.
At first, the gun industry went abroad, and I think that's really important to note. We think of the primary gun market in the United States as always being civilians, always being the pioneer, the settler, the lone individual. That's really not the case. The gun industry initially continued to look for its big contracts internationally. Winchester sold to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and that put the company on easy street, one of their memoirs said. Eventually, however, they did seek out the civilian market as the dominant one. I mean, these manufacturers were always seeking all the customers that they could, but over time, developing a domestic commercial market made sense and seemed like the next place to go. So certainly by the time of his death in 1880, Oliver Winchester had been thinking about a different way to describe his rifle. He stopped talking about armies, regiments, what this did to a troop, and he started talking more about single individuals traveling through a wild country, in his words. He began to think of his customer largely as one man and not a party of men.
By the time of his death in December 1880, Oliver Winchester could say his rifles were found throughout the world. And like Remington and Colt before him, Winchester's successful company fully passed to his family, who continued its dominant role in the American firearms industry into the 21st century. Then, 4 years after Winchester's death, the Colt and Winchester companies made a remarkable agreement.
The two big powerhouses of the firearms industry during the 19th century were Colt and Winchester. During the back part of the 19th century, they pretty much divided up the world between themselves, both in manufacturing and in sales areas. Winchester would manufacture the long arms and Colt would manufacture the handguns. During the 1870s, Colt decided that they were going to start making some of the long arms as well, and they developed a lever action rifle. Colt then was visited by a representative from Winchester who had a really neat design for a revolver and just wanted Colt to take a look at that revolver and see if they thought it might be feasible to put on the market. Colt generally got the idea that, well, since they were going into the rifles, if Winchester was going to be going into revolvers, then nobody was going to have a key to the market. So Colt and Winchester's companies, they sat down together and had this gentleman's agreement, of which there are no official records, but they did have a gentleman's agreement that Colt would no longer manufacture lever-action rifles, and in so doing, Winchester would not market any of their revolvers.
With that agreement, the golden age of early American firearm innovation and industrialization was over. Only one more innovation was needed to propel the gun culture into the 20th century, the fully automatic machine gun. The Gatling gun had been around since the Civil War. It was a machine gun that you had to crank by hand in order to fire. Gun designers dreamed that there might be some way for the gun to somehow fire automatically for as long as you could hold the trigger down. It fell to American inventor Hiram Maxim to figure it out. Born in 1840 in Sandersville, Maine, Maxim was apprenticed at age 14 to a carriage maker. In his early 20s, he began working on an idea of how to make the first fully automatic machine gun.
He had a number of various little electrical devices. He spent a fair amount of money traveling to Europe and trying to interest investors in his electrical doodads and switches and whatnot. He got very little interest. And on the way back, the legend says, he was taking the boat back across the Atlantic and he was commiserating with a fellow American. And they may have been deep in their cups, maybe he'd had a few drinks. And the other American said, you know, Maxim, don't feel bad about this. You know, Europeans are short-sighted people. If you really want to make money, figure out a way to help these Europeans cut each other's throats more efficiently. That's where the money is. Well, that's some fairly grim advice, but Maxim took it. And he started to experiment with firearms. And Maxim realized that when you fire a firearm, there's a lot of force obviously coming out of the barrel. But that explosion, that release of gases, shoves the firearm back into your shoulder or kicks it in your hand if it's a pistol. And he thought, is there a way I can harness that force? So what Maxim did after several years of experimentation is he figured out a mechanism whereby which when his weapon was fired, the barrel, essentially the rear, the breech, all slid backwards. And he used that backward force to pick up a new cartridge and reload it. So the gun fires, part of the force goes backwards. He says that's fine. You know, usually it just goes in your shoulder and it hurts. In this case, it slides backwards and it picks up a fresh cartridge, brings the cartridge forward, and then automatically fires that. And he called this recoil mechanism. So the recoil from each shot is loading and preparing a second shot. Maxims, all you do is hold down the trigger and the gun automatically keeps firing to the tune of some 600 shots per minute. He has to load the cartridges on a belt to keep them feeding into the firearm. One of the biggest technical problems he has to deal with is the barrel's getting too hot from all the shots flying through it. So he winds up constructing this cumbersome looking water jacket, essentially a barrel around the barrel filled with water to keep it from overheating. It is the first fully automatic machine gun. And by automatic, what we mean is that it is automatically firing as long as you hold the trigger down.
Although the American military was not interested in Maxim's machine gun, the British, French, Germans, and Italians readily adopted it and killed each other in staggering numbers with its firepower during World War I. However, the American story of the practical and workable machine gun wasn't over. Not with America's greatest firearms inventor on the scene, John Moses Browning. John Moses Browning was born in Ogden, Utah on January 23, 1855. Browning was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In 1852, his father established a gunsmith shop in Ogden. Working in his father's shop from the young age of 7, Browning learned the principles of engineering and manufacturing. He made his first firearm at the age of 13. In 1878, the 23-year-old Browning designed a falling block single-shot rifle, for which he was granted a patent the following year. Browning and his younger brother, Matthew Sandifer Browning, commenced making the rifles by hand in their second-floor Ogden workshop. In 1883, Winchester Repeating Arms Company took notice of this distant genius gun designer and negotiated the purchase of his single-shot design, for what would become their Model 1885 single-shot rifle. It was the beginning of the fruitful 20-year Winchester-Browning collaboration.
Browning's 125 patents resulted in 125 different models of guns. We're looking at the high wall, the low wall, the 1892 Winchester, the 94 Winchester. Elements of the Model 12 shotgun were John M. Browning's. The 1893 and 1897 Winchester pump-action shotguns were John M. Browning. Theodore Roosevelt's favorite rifle, the Winchester Model 1895, John M. Browning design. And the list goes on and on. The automatic pistols, he has the market cornered. The 1903 Colt Pocket 32, and in 1908, the 380, still the finest hand pocket gun ever made, in my opinion. There's not a hard corner on that gun, there's not a sharp angle, there's no exposed hammer. It's almost as thin as your wallet. You're just having a perfect pocket concealed weapon. That 1903 Colt can't be beat, designed by John Browning.
Most gun historians believe that Browning's Colt semi-automatic M1911 was his greatest individual achievement.
You want something that's going to stop bugs dead in their tracks and eliminate them with the first fall of the hammer? That's your 1911 Colt. That's a 45 ACP. That's John Browning. He began designing that in 1898. You know, when John Browning designed that gun originally, the gun that would become the most produced semi-automatic pistol in the standard sidearm of the United States Army from 1911 to 1985, when he first worked out his patents on that, the Wright brothers were running a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. They had never heard of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, or even developed an airfoil for a wing yet. But by the time that gun went out of service in 1985, not only had the Wright brothers come and gone and the golden age of flight come and gone, but we were well into the space age. And yet the Browning designed Colt 1911 was still state of the art. The way it was when it was originally designed, when it was replaced by a 9mm in 1985.
This is a Colt 1911, often commonly called John Browning's masterpiece. It was obviously designed by John Browning and adopted in 1911 by the United States Army as their standard issue sidearm, and remained the standard issue sidearm for the Army until about 1982 when they adopted the Beretta 9mm. This pistol was originally designed in the 45 ACP, or automatic Colt pistol. There's a lot of people that has predicted its death and demise over the years, but after 105 years, this pistol and this design is still extremely relevant in today's world. Almost every major handgun manufacturer in the world makes some version of the 1911. The 1911 is a magazine-fed semi-automatic. This magazine will hold 7 to 8 rounds depending on what version you have. And all you do is insert it into the pistol grip, release the slide, and that'll feed around into the chamber. And when you pull the trigger, the gun will fire, the slide will cycle, spit the spent case out, and then when it goes forward under spring pressure, it picks up a fresh round and chambers it. Very effective, absolute, like I said, it's one of John Browning's major masterpieces in the world of the firearms. Absolutely reliable, or the Army wouldn't have hung on to them for all those years. Accuracy was extremely good. The cartridge, the 45 ACP, at the time, was one of the most powerful cartridges designed for a handgun.
Browning approached the gun business in an entirely different way than his East Coast counterparts.
Browning had an incredible business sense, whereas Colt spent a great deal of his life, as did Winchester, in defending his patents against infringements. Because back then, it's almost like getting spam email today or false things on the internet. Back then, guys in Belgium and France, throughout Europe, would make copies of whatever was popular or working, and then sell those and they had to go out and actually actively get them to cease and desist. If they didn't defend their patent rights, they would lose them, and then with that went the royalties. Browning knew that he could set up a factory and manufacture the guns he designed, but he'd spend half of his resources and revenue in fighting off these patent infringements, these claims against his designs in patent court. So what he did was he would license the manufacture of his patents to somebody that already had an established company. And he put a codicil into the contract saying, you have to defend against all the infringers. And he says, all basically Browning did was give them the rights and set a price on his royalties. And with with Colt and Winchester manufacturing his designs, he got $1, $2, $20, depending on what the deal was, for everything they made that used one of his patents. Some of his things required more than one of his patents, and he got paid, twofold for it. With the design for different products, he felt different companies were more suited to his manufacturing. Their skills suited his designs better. With Colt, he entrusted Colt with the manufacture of his handguns, his semi-automatics, his machine guns were made by Colt. A lot of his rifle designs were made by Winchester. Shotgun designs, he originally took his shotgun designs for what would become the Browning Auto 5 to Remington.
But Browning's biggest sea change in firearms design depended on another invention. An invention that greatly increased the lethality of weapons firepower. His revolutionary design for a machine gun. A design used by virtually every automatic and semi-automatic weapon built from then into the 21st century.
So Maxim has made an amazing breakthrough, and he's going to die a very, very wealthy man. How do you copy that success? Can it even be done? It seems impossible. It seems like he's got it. He's got the patent. And a number of gun makers simply throw up their hands and pay royalties to Maxim. Look, we want to make one of these things. How much to give us permission to make them? And Maxim writes his own checks. Well, not John Moses Browning. John Moses Browning is a young man. He's a bit of a tinkerer. He's living out in Utah. He later claims, and all these firearms inventors seem to have legends associated with them, but he later claims that one day he's target shooting, and he notices that when he fires the gun, that weeds and dirt and stuff would be thrown around by the muzzle blast. And that made him think, there's power there. There's extra power there that might be utilized. And so he speculates, could I siphon some of that gas away from the muzzle, that extra energy, and use that to load another cartridge? Use that to create an automatic weapon or a reloading weapon? Will that reduce the firepower? Will that weaken the weapon somehow? He thinks, I don't think it will. So he begins experimenting, doing some innovations. He shops his design around to a few places. He had done a lot of work with Winchester. Winchester thought this was not going to go anywhere, but Colt jumped on board. So Browning invents a copycat machine gun, like the Maxim gun. His uses some of that extra gas to work the reloading mechanism. So he drills a hole in the barrel near the end, and the gun will fire, and some of the extra gas will push a lever, and that lever will reload a fresh cartridge. So he's not using recoil. He's found a way around the patent. Maxim can stew all he wants, but Browning has figured out another way to create an automatic weapon. And this becomes known as gas operation. And actually today, gas operation is far more common than recoil operation.
Browning's machine gun, the Colt Browning M1895, was nicknamed the Potato Digger by the soldiers who used it during World War I. Many firearms historians say that since the introduction of Browning's machine gun, nothing new in firearms has really been invented. Little has been done except tinkering around the edges. However, what did happen in the last 100 years was that the American firearms industry not only supplied America's own military through the country's many 20th century wars, including World Wars I and II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and the two Gulf Wars, but the American firearms industry has also supplied armies around the world. This is the untold story of how America's firearms industry and its dominating industrial might grew up together, and in the process created a unique gun culture found nowhere else on the planet. And of course, more than a century later, Winchester, Colt, Remington, and Smith & Wesson are still the big winners, still making firearms for America's military, the unique partnership that cemented America's gun culture.